The last person to see Isabella Romano alive was her own son. At 6:40 a.m., a small fishing boat left the marina in Palermo under clear skies and calm water. Tourists were already gathering along the docks, sipping coffee, watching locals prepare for an ordinary day at sea. Nothing about the departure looked unusual. Marco Romano helped his mother step into the boat with care. Witnesses later said he was calm, attentive, even affectionate. He adjusted her life vest himself. He checked the engine twice. He waved once to a man on the pier who nodded back without suspicion. By noon, the boat was found drifting several miles offshore. The engine was still running. Marco was alive. Isabella was gone. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, no emergency call. Just a pair of sandals left neatly near the stern and a purse untouched beneath the seat. Marco told the Coast Guard his mother must have slipped. A sudden wave, a moment of imbalance, an accident. But the sea that day had been almost flat, and Marco's story began changing within the first hour. First he said she went to the back of the boat alone, then he said he was adjusting the nets. Later he claimed he had briefly fallen asleep. 3 versions. 1 disappearance. As divers searched the water near Palermo, investigators began asking a quieter question, one they didn't say out loud at first. Why had Marco insisted on taking his mother out that morning, when she had refused for weeks? Why had he chosen a route far from the usual fishing areas? And why, according to phone records, had Marco deleted a call from his mother's number the night before the trip? The sea can hide many things, but it rarely erases motive. As the search expanded and Isabella's body failed to surface, a different picture began to form, one that had nothing to do with waves or accidents. Because this was not a tragedy born at sea. It was planned on land, and by the time authorities realized that Isabella Romano had not vanished, her son had already told the first lie. At first, the disappearance of Isabella Romano was treated as a maritime accident. Palermo had seen them before, elderly passengers losing balance, sudden medical episodes, currents stronger than expected. The sea offered a convenient explanation, one that required no villain and no deeper inspection. But accidents usually leave chaos behind. This one left order. The boat showed no signs of panic. The fuel tank was nearly full. The anchor was properly secured. Isabella's belongings were arranged with care, as if she had stepped away briefly, not vanished forever. More troubling was Marco Romano himself. He did not cry when the Coast Guard brought him ashore. He did not demand immediate answers. He sat quietly, answering questions politely, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he were watching something only he could see. Investigators noticed details that didn't fit. Marco had insisted on piloting the boat alone, despite rarely doing so in the past. He had chosen an unusual route south of Palermo, an area locals avoided due to unpredictable currents. And he had disabled the boat's GPS tracker shortly after leaving the marina, claiming it had malfunctioned. That explanation lasted less than an hour. When technicians examined the device, they found it had been manually powered off, deliberately. As divers searched deeper waters and days passed without a body, the narrative shifted quietly but decisively. This was no longer a rescue operation, it was an investigation. Authorities began reconstructing Isabella's final weeks on land, her finances, her relationships, her private fears. What they uncovered painted a far darker picture than anything the sea could hide. Isabella had recently changed her will. She had withdrawn a large sum of money, and she had told a close friend something chilling just 3 days before she disappeared. "If something happens to me," she said, "don't believe it was an accident." The sea around Palermo remained calm, but beneath that surface, a different storm was forming, one built from betrayal, calculation, and a son who may have decided that his mother was worth more to him gone than alive. The truth would not be found in the water. It would be found in the choices made long before the boat ever left the dock. Isabella Romano had never trusted the sea. She grew up in Palermo, surrounded by it, yet she preferred to admire it from a distance, through cafe windows, from the safety of the harbor, from land that did not move beneath her feet. When Marco was younger, she refused every invitation to go fishing with him, always offering the same excuse: "I get dizzy too easily." That was why Marco's insistence that morning felt strange to those who knew them. He had shown up at her apartment before sunrise, unusually prepared. Clean clothes, shaved, a thermos of coffee already warm. He told her the weather would be perfect, that the water would be calm, that it would be just a short ride. Isabella hesitated. According to a neighbor, she stood in the doorway for several minutes, her purse already on her shoulder, asking the same question twice. "Are you sure this is necessary?" Marco smiled and nodded. "It's important, Mama." He didn't explain why. What investigators would later discover is that Marco had been under pressure for months. His debts were not casual or temporary. They were layered: credit cards, private loans, and money owed to people who did not use contracts. Isabella knew part of this. She had helped him before, paid small sums, covered late rent. But recently she had refused to give him more. Friends recalled her saying Marco had become desperate and unpredictable. 3 weeks before the trip, Isabella met with a lawyer. She did not tell her son. The changes she made were significant. She removed Marco as sole beneficiary. She placed conditions on access to her savings, and she added a clause that would freeze her accounts entirely if her death appeared suspicious. That clause mattered more than anyone realized at the time. The morning of the trip, Marco guided the boat away from the marina with steady hands. Witnesses described him as calm, focused, almost relieved. Isabella sat near the bow, clutching her bag, glancing back toward the shrinking shoreline. She never wore sunglasses. She wanted to see everything. Once they reached open water, Marco altered course. Instead of heading toward the usual fishing areas, he steered south, toward deeper water, where currents were stronger and boat traffic was rare. When Isabella asked why, he told her the fish had been moving lately. It was a lie. At approximately 9:12 a.m., Marco powered off the GPS tracker. That decision would later define the case, not because accidents don't happen, but because disabling tracking requires intent. You have to know where the switch is. You have to want to disappear, even briefly. Investigators believe the confrontation happened shortly after. What was said on that boat will never be known. But evidence suggested Isabella had realized something was wrong. Her purse remained untouched. Her phone was powered off but not thrown away. Her sandals were placed neatly near the stern, not scattered as they would be in panic. That detail haunted detectives. People who fall do not remove their shoes. Marco later claimed he heard a splash and turned too late. But forensic analysis of the boat showed no sudden movement, no imbalance, no marks consistent with a fall. Only one set of footprints moved toward the back of the boat that morning, and they belonged to Marco. When authorities questioned him that afternoon, they noticed something else. His hands were clean, no scratches, no rope burns, no signs of a struggle. The sea had taken Isabella Romano, but the evidence suggested her son had guided it exactly where he needed it to be. Marco Romano repeated his story so many times that it began to sound rehearsed even to himself. Each version carried the same backbone. His mother stood, the boat rocked, the sea took her. But the details kept shifting, sliding into places that contradicted the physical evidence. Investigators noticed how he spoke in generalities when pressed, how he replaced specifics with emotion. She was old. She lost her balance. It happened so fast. None of it matched the boat. The deck showed no scuff marks near the stern. The railing was dry. The engine speed recorded by onboard diagnostics never fluctuated suddenly, as it would have if Marco had reacted to a fall. The boat had continued on a straight line for nearly 2 minutes after Isabella supposedly vanished. 2 minutes is a long time when someone falls into open water. It is an eternity if you are watching. When questioned about the GPS, Marco claimed ignorance. He said it must have malfunctioned. When confronted with evidence of manual deactivation, he shrugged and said he might have touched something by accident. Investigators stopped asking technical questions after that. They shifted focus. They began reconstructing Marco's life in the weeks before the trip. What they found was not a man planning a crime impulsively, but one methodically cornered. Marco had lost his job months earlier and hidden it from his mother. He borrowed money from friends until no one answered his calls. Then he borrowed from strangers, then from men who charged interest that grew weekly. Text messages retrieved from his phone revealed threats disguised as reminders. "You said Friday. This can't wait. Family is family." The last message arrived the night before the boat trip. Marco did not reply. Phone records showed he had deleted a call from Isabella that same night. Investigators believed she had confronted him after discovering documents related to her updated will. Papers Marco had accidentally left visible in her apartment days earlier. The argument was not recorded, but neighbors reported raised voices. The next morning, Marco arrived early, prepared. That detail changed everything. This was not a spontaneous decision. The boat trip was not a favor or a family outing. It was a controlled environment, isolated, unmonitored, and irreversible. At sea, there are no witnesses, and blame dissolves quickly. The Coast Guard expanded the search radius for days, but currents moved unpredictably. Each passing hour reduced the likelihood of recovering a body. Without Isabella, the case rested entirely on circumstantial evidence. That was exactly what Marco had counted on. But he had miscalculated one thing. Isabella had anticipated him. The lawyer she met weeks earlier had documented her concerns in detail. She spoke of fear, of pressure, of her son's volatility. She specifically mentioned the sea. She said he kept insisting on taking her out on the boat, the lawyer later testified. She didn't know why, but it frightened her. That testimony changed the tone of the investigation. This was no longer about whether Marco had pushed his mother. It was about whether he had planned her disappearance, knowing the sea would erase proof. Financial analysts traced Marco's debts backward. The timing aligned perfectly. Payments were due days after the trip. His access to Isabella's accounts, if she were legally declared dead, would resolve everything. Or so he thought. What Marco did not know was that Isabella's new will included a safeguard triggered by suspicion. Until her death could be conclusively ruled accidental, her assets were frozen. No inheritance, no access, no relief. As the days passed and the search officially shifted from rescue to recovery, Marco's demeanor changed. He grew restless, defensive. His calm cracked under subtle pressure. He began asking investigators when the case would be closed. That question alone raised alarms. People who lose someone do not rush endings. They cling to hope. Marco wanted finality, because without it, the truth hovered just beneath the surface, waiting for one mistake, one contradiction, one witness willing to say out loud what everyone was beginning to suspect. Isabella Romano had not vanished into the sea. She had been delivered to it, and the person who brought her there was running out of places to hide. With no body and no confession, the investigation entered its most dangerous phase: time. In cases like Isabella Romano's, time does not clarify. It erodes. Memories soften. Witnesses second-guess themselves. The sea does what it always does. It hides. But Palermo investigators understood something Marco did not. People who plan disappearances often overlook the weight of routine. They assume that if the final act leaves no trace, everything before it becomes irrelevant. That assumption is usually fatal. Detectives began rebuilding Isabella's final month hour by hour. Bank withdrawals, pharmacy visits, bus routes, conversations overheard in cafes where she sat at the same table every morning. A pattern emerged. Isabella had been preparing to leave, not Palermo, her life. She had asked about assisted living options outside Sicily. She had inquired about transferring her pension. She had sold several personal items quietly, not out of need, but out of intention. She was making herself harder to reach. When asked why, a friend gave a simple answer. She was afraid of Marco. That fear had not come suddenly. It had grown slowly, fed by small outbursts, desperate phone calls and visits at odd hours. Marco had begun showing up unannounced. He demanded help, but avoided explanation. When Isabella asked questions, his tone shifted. He never threatened her. He didn't need to. Fear does not require violence to exist. Investigators also discovered that Isabella had requested copies of Marco's birth certificate and financial records weeks earlier. At first, this seemed maternal, an attempt to help, but paired with the will, it told a different story. She was documenting, protecting herself, and possibly preparing to confront him. On the morning of the boat trip, Isabella had left a handwritten note on her kitchen table. It was not a goodbye. It did not mention the sea. It simply listed phone numbers, a lawyer, a friend, and the local police station. At the bottom she wrote one sentence: "If I don't come back, please talk to them." That note transformed the investigation. It was no longer circumstantial. It was anticipatory. Marco's defense began to collapse quietly. Lawyers advised him to stop speaking. He refused at first, insisting that cooperation would clear everything up. But each statement only deepened inconsistencies. He claimed love. Yet his phone showed no unanswered calls to his mother after the trip. No frantic attempts, no messages begging her to respond. Instead, he made 3 calls to creditors within 48 hours. That detail sealed his fate in the minds of detectives. People who lose a parent do not think about debt first. As pressure mounted, Marco began making mistakes. He visited the marina repeatedly, staring at the water. He asked dock workers questions about currents. He asked how long bodies usually take to surface. Those questions were noted. Surveillance footage showed him revisiting the exact slip where the boat had departed, standing alone, waiting. For what? No one could say. The prosecutor's office began preparing a case without a body, a risky move in Italy, where courts favor physical proof. But Isabella had left something stronger than evidence. She had left intent. Her fear, her documentation, her preparation, all of it pointed in one direction. Marco had not taken his mother on a boat ride. He had taken her to the only place where he believed consequences would drown. What he did not understand was that the sea removes bodies, but it preserves patterns, and patterns once visible are almost impossible to erase. As the investigation deepened, Marco's isolation became total. Friends stopped answering his calls. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Even his creditors, once relentless, fell silent, sensing that whatever resolution they expected would not come quickly, if at all. That silence unnerved him more than threats ever had. Without a body, Marco believed the case would eventually stall. He had counted on fatigue, on investigators being reassigned, on files being shelved, on the sea doing what it had always done. But the prosecutor had made a quiet decision. They would not wait for Isabella Romano to be found. They would build the case around behavior. Financial experts testified first. They outlined Marco's debt in precise detail: amounts, dates, escalation. They showed how payments were due days after the boat trip, how interest multiplied weekly, how default carried consequences far more serious than embarrassment. Then came the phone records, deleted calls, erased messages, a deliberate attempt to clean digital traces the night before the trip. Marco's defense argued panic, stress, confusion. But stress does not explain preparation. Next came the marina witnesses, not dramatic testimony, just small observations. Marco checking the engine twice. Marco insisting on that specific route. Marco refusing help that morning even when offered. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together they formed a timeline that left no room for chance. The most damaging testimony came from Isabella's lawyer. He described her calm demeanor, her clarity, the absence of confusion or cognitive decline. He repeated her words exactly as she had spoken them weeks before her disappearance. She told me, "If something happens to me at sea, please look at my son first." The courtroom fell silent. Marco stared straight ahead. That sentence did what no forensic report could. It gave Isabella a voice. The defense attempted to discredit her fear, suggesting paranoia, age-related anxiety, exaggeration. But the note on her kitchen table, verified as written that morning, destroyed that argument. Fear documented in advance is not hysteria. It is foresight. When Marco finally took the stand, his confidence faltered for the first time. He repeated his story again, but now it sounded hollow even to him. He spoke of love, of regret, of wishing he had held her tighter. The prosecutor asked one question. "If your mother fell accidentally, why didn't you turn the boat around immediately?" Marco hesitated. I was in shock." The prosecutor nodded. "For 2 minutes?" Silence. Marco swallowed. "I don't know." That was enough. The court did not need to know how Isabella Romano went into the sea. Whether she was pushed, guided, or left without help no longer mattered. What mattered was intent. Marco had created a situation where survival depended entirely on him, and then failed to act. In Italian law, that failure was not an accident. It was homicide by omission. When the verdict was read, the courtroom did not erupt. There were no shouts, no gasps. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the truth, delayed but intact, had finally surfaced. Isabella's body was never recovered. The sea kept that secret. But the reason for her disappearance did not vanish with her. Marco Romano was sentenced to prison, not as a grieving son, but as a man who believed the ocean would absolve him. It did not, because water erases evidence, but it cannot erase intention. And intention, once exposed, has a way of floating back to the surface, no matter how deep it was pushed. Even after the verdict, the case of Isabella Romano refused to settle. There are crimes that end when the sentence is read, and others that continue to disturb long after the courtroom empties. This was the second kind, not because of doubt about Marco's guilt, but because of the unanswered details, the ones the sea had kept. Investigators reviewing the case post-trial began to notice something they hadn't fully addressed before: the boat itself. Forensic analysis conducted months after the disappearance revealed that the vessel had been meticulously prepared, not in a way that screamed premeditation, but in a way that suggested foresight. The non-slip mats near the stern had been removed. A safety rope, usually tied along the railing, was missing. Marco claimed he had taken it off weeks earlier for maintenance. There was no record of that. More troubling was the anchor. It had been deployed briefly that morning, something Marco had never mentioned. The pattern of wear on the chain indicated it had been lowered and raised within a short window, likely before Isabella vanished. Why anchor a boat in deep open water? The answer was uncomfortable: to stop drifting, to control position, to create time. Investigators theorized that Marco had anchored the boat to keep it steady while he confronted his mother. A stable platform eliminates accidents. It removes uncertainty. It also gives someone options. That theory explained the neat placement of Isabella's sandals. She hadn't lost them. She had removed them, likely at Marco's request, likely under the pretense of safety. "Sit here, Mama." Just for a moment. The words themselves were never recorded, but the physical evidence spoke clearly enough. Another detail surfaced during a re-examination of Marco's phone backups, data he believed had been permanently deleted. A voice memo, time-stamped 2 nights before the trip, survived in cloud storage. It was brief, 30 seconds. Marco's voice was calm. "I just need it to look like nothing," he said. "The sea does the rest." That recording was never used at trial. It surfaced too late. But for those who heard it, any lingering ambiguity vanished. The crime had not been impulsive. It had been rehearsed. Prison psychologists later described Marco as methodical rather than violent. A man who avoided confrontation until cornered, someone who believed problems could be managed rather than faced. In his mind, Isabella had become a variable, a liability, and the sea, a solution that required no confession. What haunted investigators most was not the crime itself, but how close it came to working. Had Isabella not documented her fear, the case might have dissolved into maritime statistics. Had Marco waited longer to change his story, suspicion might have softened. Had he shown even a trace of genuine panic, the narrative could have shifted. Instead, his need for control betrayed him. Control over finances, control over narrative, control over environment. In the end, it was that same need that exposed him. Years later, a fisherman off the coast of Palermo reported seeing a piece of fabric tangled in his nets, old, waterlogged, unidentifiable. Authorities examined it and quietly concluded it was impossible to confirm its origin. They did not reopen the case. They did not need to. The truth had already surfaced in a different way, not through a body, but through preparation. Isabella Romano had understood something crucial before she ever stepped onto that boat. The greatest danger was not the sea. It was the sun, who believed he could choreograph her disappearance and walk away untouched. He had underestimated one thing, her foresight, and foresight, once recorded, outlives even the deepest water. In prison, Marco Romano maintained his innocence with discipline, not loudly, not defiantly. He filed appeals quietly, avoided interviews, and declined every offer to tell his story publicly. Guards described him as compliant. Other inmates described him as distant. He did not argue. He did not fight. He observed. That, more than anger, unsettled people. Psychological evaluations painted a consistent picture. Marco did not deny responsibility outright. He reframed it. In his version of events, the sea was the agent. He was merely present when it acted. That mental separation mattered to him. It allowed him to sleep. During therapy sessions, Marco returned repeatedly to one idea, that his mother had forced his hand by changing her will. He spoke of betrayal, not from a son to a mother, but the reverse. In his mind, Isabella had violated an unspoken contract. Family protects family. What he never addressed was why protection to him had required isolation. The psychologists noted his fixation on control. When asked what he regretted most, Marco did not mention his mother's death. He mentioned the investigation. "I didn't think they'd look so closely," he said once. "I thought it would end." That sentence became part of his permanent file. Meanwhile, Isabella Romano's absence reshaped the lives she had touched. Friends continued to gather at the same cafe where she once sat each morning. Her chair remained empty, untouched by habit rather than instruction. Some days they spoke about her openly. Other days they avoided her name entirely, as if silence might spare them the weight of memory. Her lawyer ensured that her remaining assets were redirected exactly as she had requested: donations to organizations supporting elderly abuse prevention, legal aid, and victims of financial coercion within families. No money went to Marco. That too was deliberate. In Palermo, the case became a quiet reference point. Not a headline, but a cautionary example discussed among prosecutors and social workers. A reminder that danger does not always arrive with raised voices or visible violence. Sometimes it arrives politely, prepared, smiling. Years passed, the sea yielded nothing. And yet the case did not fade. University law courses dissected it. Psychologists cited it. Investigators used it to train new officers to recognize patterns of staged accidents. particularly those involving family members and environments designed to erase accountability. Marco aged in prison. His appeals failed one by one. Each denial narrowed the world he could control until only his internal narrative remained. That narrative never changed. He did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as someone who had managed an outcome. That belief, more than the sentence itself, ensured he would never truly confront what he had done. Isabella Romano, however, had confronted the truth long before her disappearance. She had seen the shift in her son. She had sensed the danger. And rather than flee, she documented, she prepared. She ensured that even if her body vanished, her intent would remain. In doing so, she denied Marco the one thing he sought above all else: erasure. Her story did not end in the sea. It continued, in courtrooms, in classrooms, in quiet conversations between parents and children about money, dependency, and boundaries. The lesson was not about boats or currents, it was about proximity, about how the most dangerous betrayals often occur within the smallest circles, where trust is assumed and oversight is absent. Marco had believed the ocean would absolve him. Instead, it became the backdrop against which his actions were finally understood. And Isabella Romano, though never recovered, was never truly lost, because what she left behind, foresight, documentation, and courage, proved stronger than water, stronger than silence, and far stronger than the son who believed she would simply disappear. Long after the case was closed, one question continued to surface among those who had followed it closely. Why Palermo? Not why Isabella disappeared there, but why Marco chose that specific place to execute his plan. The answer had nothing to do with sentiment or familiarity. It had to do with probability. The waters south of Palermo are deceptively complex. Surface calm hides shifting undercurrents, sudden drops in depth, and temperature layers that pull objects downward instead of carrying them back to shore. Bodies disappear there more often than statistics suggest, not because of violence, but because recovery is difficult. Marco knew this. Records later showed he had researched maritime incidents weeks before the trip. Search patterns, recovery timelines. The average window before a missing person at sea was legally presumed dead. He had not studied the ocean out of love for it. He had studied it as a tool. Investigators revisiting the case years later uncovered another overlooked detail. Marco had filed an insurance inquiry months before Isabella vanished. Casual, indirect, framed as curiosity. He asked about accidental death coverage, about maritime exclusions, about beneficiary clauses. He never finalized a policy. But he learned enough. The plan, in hindsight, was layered but not flawless. It relied on silence, on routine, on the assumption that an elderly woman's fears would be dismissed as anxiety. It relied on the sea doing what it had done for centuries, take without explanation. What Marco failed to anticipate was the accumulation of small signals. Fear, documented quietly. Preparation mistaken for paranoia. Love that transformed into vigilance. Isabella had not fought physically. There were no bruises to testify for her. Instead, she had fought administratively, legally, methodically. She had turned systems, law, documentation, witnesses into her last line of defense. That choice mattered. In the years following the conviction, similar cases across Italy were re-examined. Elderly relatives lost at sea, falls from boats, accidents that left no witnesses and no bodies. Patterns emerged: financial pressure, caregiver dependency, controlled environments. The Romano case became a reference point, not because it was unique, but because it was visible. It proved that disappearance does not equal innocence, and that motive can survive water. For families in Palermo, the case altered conversations. Elderly parents began speaking more openly about finances. Lawyers reported an increase in clients requesting protective clauses. Social workers noticed a shift in awareness, fear no longer dismissed so easily when it came from within the family. Isabella Romano did not intend to become a symbol, but her foresight made her one. As for Marco, prison stripped him of external control, but never internal justification. He continued to tell himself the same story, that circumstances forced his hand, that he had no real choice. The system disagreed. It judged him not for pushing a body into the sea, but for constructing a situation where survival depended entirely on his restraint, and then withholding it. That distinction defined the case. It was not about violence. It was about intent, environment, and omission. The sea had played its role, but it was not the villain. It was merely the stage. And the tragedy of Isabella Romano lay not in where she vanished, but in how close the danger had always been before the boat ever left the dock. As years passed, the story of Isabella Romano settled into a quieter place in Palermo's collective memory. Not forgotten, but absorbed. It became one of those cases people referenced without needing to explain, a shared understanding of how easily trust could be weaponized. The most unsettling aspect remained the absence. No grave, no remains, no moment of physical farewell. Families of missing persons often describe grief as unfinished business. In Isabella's case, that unfinished space became a warning rather than a wound. Local authorities began using the case during training sessions, not to sensationalize it, but to teach something subtle, that crimes within families rarely announce themselves with force. They arrive wrapped in routine, obligation, and emotional leverage. Investigators highlighted Marco's calm demeanor, his insistence on normalcy, his strategic patience. None of those traits were inherently criminal, but together, under pressure, they formed a profile that could no longer be ignored. One officer involved in the original search later admitted something uncomfortable. "If her lawyer hadn't spoken up," he said, "we would have called it an accident." That admission reshaped how future cases were handled. Suddenly, elderly complaints were documented more carefully. Financial entanglements were examined earlier. Accident stopped being the default explanation when the beneficiary was the last person present. Isabella's foresight had not only protected her own truth, it had quietly changed procedure. Marco's final appeal was denied a decade after his conviction. By then, his name had faded from headlines entirely. He was no longer the son from Palermo, no longer the man who vanished his mother at sea. He was just another inmate. And that anonymity, ironically, was the one thing he never intended for himself. In his mind, the plan had been perfect because it removed him from scrutiny. Instead, it placed him under it permanently. The sea did not erase his actions, it magnified them. Isabella Romano's life did not end in silence. It echoed in courtrooms, in policy changes, in families who learned to recognize manipulation before it hardened into tragedy. Her story was not about water or boats. It was about proximity, about how danger is most convincing when it wears the face of familiarity, and about how preparation, quiet and unassuming, can outlast even the most calculated disappearance. The Mediterranean continued to move as it always had, indifferent, vast, unknowable. But somewhere within that vastness, the truth remained intact. Not because the sea returned it, but because Isabella had ensured it would surface anyway. In the end, what unsettled those closest to the Isabella Romano case was not Marco's crime, but how ordinary the path toward it had been. There was no single moment where everything broke, no dramatic escalation, no clear warning that could not be explained away at the time. That was the danger. Marco had not lived as a monster. He lived as a son who failed slowly, quietly, and privately. His debts grew in silence. His desperation hid behind excuses. His dependence on his mother deepened until it hardened into resentment. Psychologists later described it as entitlement under pressure, the belief that love creates obligation, and obligation justifies coercion. Marco never saw himself as cruel. In his internal logic, he was correcting an imbalance. His mother had resources, he had problems. The solution in his mind was simple. What broke that logic was Isabella's awareness. She noticed the shift in his tone. She sensed the urgency behind his affection. She recognized the danger of isolation disguised as care, and she acted, not dramatically, not confrontationally, but precisely. That precision denied Marco what he needed most: deniability. Even after conviction, legal scholars continued to analyze the case because it existed in a grey space many crimes occupy. There was no violent act captured on camera, no confession, no body, only structure, the structure of a plan, the structure of financial motive, the structure of a mission. In many ways, Isabella's disappearance forced the legal system to confront an uncomfortable truth. Intent does not require witnesses if it leaves enough pattern behind. Her case became a reference for something rarely discussed openly: familial ambush crimes. Situations where victims are lured into environments designed to remove accountability, often by people they trust implicitly. Boats, remote roads, isolated homes, places where control can be exercised quietly. Social workers and elder care advocates began using Isabella's story anonymously in workshops. They focused not on the crime itself, but on the warning signs she recognized early. Pressure framed as concern, isolation framed as protection, financial urgency framed as temporary. Those patterns repeated far more often than anyone liked to admit. Marco, meanwhile, receded into the background of his own story. Prison records showed a man who complied with rules but never engaged in reflection. He avoided programs focused on accountability. He preferred solitude. When asked once if he missed his mother, he responded simply, "I think about the sea." That answer chilled the interviewer, because it revealed that Marco still did not think of Isabella as a person he had lost, but as an outcome he had failed to manage. The case did not need new evidence to remain relevant. It needed memory. Isabella Romano had understood something profound before her death: that silence favors the person applying pressure, not the one enduring it. By documenting, preparing, and trusting others with her fears, she disrupted that silence. And in doing so, she transformed what could have been an invisible crime into a permanent record of intent. The sea took her body, but it did not take her voice. That voice continued, quietly, persistently, wherever people listened closely enough to recognize danger not in chaos, but in calm. The final lesson of the Romano case did not come from a courtroom, a prison cell, or the sea itself. It came from the space Isabella left behind. In Palermo, her apartment was eventually cleared, furniture donated, papers archived, photographs boxed and labeled by someone who had never met her. But one item remained untouched for years: a small notebook found in the back of a kitchen drawer. It was not a diary. It contained no emotions, no confessions, no dramatic language. Only dates, names, observations, short entries written in steady handwriting. Marco asked again today, tone sharper than before. Says it will only be for a moment. Feels urgent. Feels wrong. To anyone else, the notebook might have looked insignificant. To investigators, it was devastating. It proved something courts rarely get to see so clearly: that Isabella had been aware, rational, and afraid for a reason. Her fear was not imagined. It was accumulated. That notebook was never published. It did not need to be. Its purpose had already been fulfilled. It connected the final missing thread between intent and outcome. Marco's belief that silence would protect him was the same belief that destroyed him. Silence protects the person in control. Documentation protects the person at risk. That truth extended far beyond Palermo. Years later, similar cases across Europe quietly cited Romano versus State in legal footnotes. Elder abuse statutes were amended. Guidelines shifted. Investigators were trained to ask a new question early in missing person cases. Who benefits if this is an accident? That question alone changed outcomes. Marco Romano died in prison 12 years into his sentence from natural causes. There were no public statements. No appeals left to file. His death barely registered beyond a brief notice in a local paper. There was no mention of Isabella, no acknowledgement. And yet, her influence outlasted him completely. Families who never heard her name were safer because of her foresight. Victims who recognized early pressure were believed more quickly. Crimes that once dissolved into ambiguity were examined with sharper eyes. Isabella Romano had not escaped her fate, but she had controlled the narrative that followed it. That distinction mattered, because crimes within families rarely announce themselves as crimes. They arrive disguised as obligation, framed as love, hidden inside routines no one questions. The sea did not create this tragedy. It only revealed how fragile trust can become when desperation enters the room. Isabella stepped onto that boat, knowing something was wrong. She went anyway, not because she was naive, but because she believed preparation would speak when she could not. And it did. Her body never returned to shore. Her truth did. And in the quiet aftermath, long after waves erased footprints and headlines faded, one fact remained undeniable. The most dangerous ambushes are not the ones that attack suddenly. They are the ones that ask politely. And Isabella Romano heard that question, recognized it for what it was, and answered it in the only way left to her, by leaving proof behind. In the end, the sea never gave back what it took, but it didn't need to, because Isabella Romano had already ensured that her disappearance would not become silence. This story was never about waves, currents, or accidents at sea. It was about how trust can be transformed into a weapon when desperation replaces care. About how crimes within families do not arrive screaming. They arrive calmly, with familiar faces and reasonable excuses. Marco believed the ocean would erase responsibility. He believed distance would become innocence. That absence would become doubt. That time would soften suspicion. What he underestimated was preparation. Isabella understood something many victims realized too late. When danger comes from someone close, survival is not always about escape. Sometimes it is about documentation, about leaving a trail strong enough to speak when you no longer can. She didn't fight on that boat. She didn't scream. She didn't leave visible marks. Instead, she left intent behind. Recorded, consistent, undeniable, and intent is heavier than water. Her story did not end in Palermo's harbor. It continued in courtrooms, in policy changes, and in quiet moments when other families recognized warning signs early enough to act. This is why the case still matters, not because of how Isabella died, but because of how she anticipated what would be said about her death. The most unsettling truth is not that a son betrayed his mother. It's that he believed politeness, routine, and proximity would protect him. They did not. The sea erased the body, but it could not erase foresight, and foresight, once documented, outlives even the deepest disappearance.